18 lectures throughout this year on the spiritual quest with guidance from Ronner. We'll all be Ronerian experts by the end of this. If you go along and do the reading at each time, you will, by the end of this, read through the whole of the foundations of Christian itself, 450-some pages here. But for those who are not doing it that way, it's also possible to take up these particular questions, and we hope get something out of it with guidance from our friend Karl Ronner. So in this first section, the first series of 6 of the 18 lectures this quarter, we've been talking a lot about the searching for various things, searching for ourselves, for our God, for deeper religious experience. And tonight, the search is for what I call a committed openness, to find out how we can be people of commitment, and yet people who remain fundamentally open to other options in life. That is a most difficult kind of problem that we face in our own time. Now, as usual, I'm going to draw on a particular experience, a story that I will tell you, and then refer throughout to the ways I might try to respond to this particular story. And indeed, it is a very typical one, maybe more typical than some people are aware. But it is the story of a young man who comes from a good Catholic family and who has grown up in a Catholic environment all of his life. He has gone to Catholic schools, and upon his graduation from high school, he is shipped off to the university. He comes to the university, and he encounters there a lot of different kind of situations. And when he goes to the masses on campus, he immediately affiliates with a campus church. That's what his whole bent is. That's what his folks want him to do, and he does this. And he, at this point, finds that there's some questioning going on, because the liturgy is much more liberal there than he's used to, and they have things like liturgical dance or clowns running around or all kinds of things, and he finds this vaguely disquieting. Well, in the midst of this, he encounters some of his people who live on his dorm floor, and they begin to talk a little religion. He expresses some of this disquiet with his current religious situation, and they invite him to come to their prayer group. And these people, he's not too interested in doing that. In fact, he's sort of afraid to do that. But what he finds out is these people really are nice to him. They do him all kinds of favors. They talk to him. They're very warm. They invite him to do a lot of different things. They're involved in what has come commonly to be known as love bombing. That is, they are putting a lot of energy into this particular young man and showing him all kind of care and concern and so on. Well, before long, they eventually, through this technique, get him to come to their group. It is a very scripturally oriented group. They have a leader in the group who tells them what they're going to read in the scriptures and pretty much how to interpret what is there. They keep talking about just getting the meaning right out of the Bible and not having other things in the way and so on. Talk about literal reading of the scriptures and that the Lord speaks to them through that particular method and so on. And the group is very congenial and very warm, and everyone who comes there feels very welcome. Any newcomer, everyone takes a lot of time to show them interest and so on. Well, as time goes on, this young man, he comes to Mass sometimes, but he also goes to this prayer group, and very often he feels torn between. He doesn't know if he really should be doing that or not. He doesn't like when he goes to Mass, it's not as warm, as inviting. People aren't so personal there, and he gets turned off a little by that, and he finds himself gravitating to this other group. Well, before long, in the other group, he begins to catch some other signals. The other signals are something like, well, you really ought to give up that Catholic church of yours. That's really nothing but trouble. Those people are not really readers of the Bible, you know. They got all these traditions that aren't found in the Scriptures. And so he starts picking up signals like this. He was saying that the Catholic tradition of yours is really anti-God. It's not good at all. It's more like the work of the demonic forces. It's the devil's work. And they give him some literature. And this literature, it's almost in comic book form. And in there it has all kind of charges against the Catholic Church. It says in there that Catholics are cannibals, and it has a quote from the Council of Trent about that the Catholics eat the flesh of Jesus Christ, and so on. And it points out clearly how Catholics are cannibals. It points out, using some quotes from the Council of Ephesus, that indeed Catholics worship Mary, and that there's no scriptural basis for this, and the Catholics are out of line in worshiping Mary. Puts in there things about the Catholics hold the doctrine of purgatory, which is a strange doctrine and has absolutely no basis in the Bible at all. In the book it says that Catholics have no care for the Scriptures, that the Catholic has always been against personal reading of the Bible. Catholics aren't supposed to read the Scripture. They're discouraged from that, and they have quotes from certain popes in there that suggest that Catholics should be very careful of private interpretation of the Bible. You get a whole comic book kind of thing like this, of all of these charges against the church. And now the young man is really confused and very doubtful about all of this. And the friends keep doing this love bombing, and they keep insisting that the pure Word of God is found in their group, and that this young man really is not going to be saved if he does not join up with them, and if he doesn't read the Scriptures in the way that they do, that he is in great danger of damnation if he continues to be affiliated with this Catholic Church. Well, that perhaps is enough to set the stage. Now, that whole thing there raises certain kinds of generalized problems. The one is the problem of religious exclusivism. We have an example here in this small Bible study group, non-denominational group as they like to call themselves, an example of what I like to call a new exclusivism that's at work in our world. It is the rise of the notion that there is only one way to get to the great God. It's insistent on only one way of understanding the Scriptures in what they call a fundamentalist way, a way that at times at least stresses the literal character of the Scriptures, and especially the notion that through those Scriptures God gives unambiguous answers to the problems of life. This group really believes that they are in the light and that everyone else is in the darkness. They believe that they have a monopoly on the truth, and that people who disagree with them are really demonic groups, that they are influenced by the devil. They're the work of Satan, and they are keeping people from coming to the light and eventually being saved. So we have here an example of a new exclusivism. Now, that, I mean, some people have run into that. Probably almost everybody here has either got a relative or somebody they know who has moved in that kind of direction. We have a tremendous attrition rate now with Catholic people moving into that kind of exclusivism. Catholics, in fact, seem to be real fresh prey for these people. Catholics especially, who have lived at one time in a rigid sort of authoritarian structure where infallibility was very big and everything held together neatly and firmly, one could be absolutely sure of the truth. For many Catholic people, that has been shattered, and it's become much more gray in tone. There are more disputed questions, more opinions floating around, more different ways of doing things, different ways of celebrating the liturgy. And because of this, people are feeling chaotic, at loose ends, not sure of who they are or where they fit. And in that state of insecurity, very often the new exclusivism has great appeal, especially because of the warm atmosphere that's there and the dogmatic character of the teachings. It almost sounds to some Catholics when they drift into those groups like they were back in the 50s, before the Second Vatican Council, when priests talked with that same kind of definiteness and authority about what is right and wrong and what God wants, what you're supposed to do and what you're supposed to believe. It sounds familiar to many Catholic people, and for some it sounds very attractive, this new exclusivism. Now let me generalize the problem even more, because it doesn't apply just to that kind of question. There's many ways in which there is a temptation in life to be exclusive. You know, one way, in a sort of broad sense, is to be exclusive in terms of our Western civilization and our way of doing things vis-a-vis the Eastern world. The sense that the West is the repository of all truth, that if we're going to deal with India, the best thing to do is have them get rid of their religious traditions and adopt American technology, that's the best way for Indians to function. And while I'm talking about that country of India, you could see that same sort of exclusivism in the way that the native Indians in the United States were treated when the colonists came here, when the Spanish moved up from the south and so on. It was that same idea. We know the truth, and what we got to do is get all you people baptized and saved, all of you heathens. An example of sort of a Europeanized exclusivism. A lot of that occurred in what we call the whole colonial movement, where that was our sense of how we should deal with other people. We had it in the missionary effort in China, that is commonly thought that that's why the Chinese never really were converted to Christianity, because it was an effort to place upon them a Europeanized version of Christianity. The way it was done in Rome was the way it had to be done in China. So there was no opportunity for an indigenous Chinese Christianity to develop. And therefore the Chinese didn't want it. It didn't fit in with their temperament, their outlook, their ancestral ways, with the way they were dominantly raised and so on. So there was a rejection of that. Another example of religious exclusivism at work. So you can find this all over. We find it in a nationalistic sense, that the United States always goes to the bargaining table with clean hands. We're the nation that wears the white hats, and all those other people are bad. It's the kind of reaction you get in the bishops in the peace pastoral, where the bishops in the second draft said, "We dare not think of the Soviet people or their leaders just as monsters." And that line somehow was a red flag to many red-blooded American people. That sense that it says in there that we got to remember the Russian people are made in God's image as well, and so on. And that flies in the face very often of an exclusivist kind of nationalism that wants to think that our way is the only way, that we're the good force in the world, and that all the other elements that do things differently from us are necessarily bad. A lot of us got this in the 50s with the McCarthy era, with the whole excessive anti-communism that went on at that time, and all the people who were persecuted, people in the arts, the movies, the intellectuals, who had in one way dabbled with Marxism or knew about it or attended a meeting once in their life, and their name often was smeared and so on as being communists. So we've known that kind of exclusivism in our political world as well. Many people would say we've seen it again in the last political campaign, where there's certain groups running around saying that if you don't do it our way, if you don't think of it our way, then you're really not Christian. That there's only one Christian way to approach these political, economic, and social questions. It's a co-optation of the religious language, as though people who disagree with this particular position say of some members of the moral majority, for example, or the Christian voice, that if one is not speaking with their voice, that the voice therefore is not Christian. That's, of course, what many people objected to with the religious exclusivists in the last campaign. Well, we can probably bring this down to a much more personal level. Well, we can see exclusivism arise in the male-female relationships. So that sometimes, men will say, well, we're the only ones who think logically, or we're the only ones who can get things done, or we're the only ones that know how to run things. You couldn't possibly have a woman president. She'd be too emotional or something, and wouldn't be able to function in that way. Maybe we get on the fringes of the feminist movement the same kind of exclusivism, as though males cannot enter the debate on what it means to be human, or that men are ruled out of the conversation entirely when it comes to making progress in life. What would be interesting about all this, I think, is to try to recognize our own brand of exclusivism. I mean, it's sort of easy to make fun of the program that Rome adopted with the Chinese and trying to make them Europeanized Christians or something. It's easy to be sort of in an outrage over the way the American Indians were treated in our culture. And all of that really is a genuine sign of exclusivism. But it would probably be more helpful, personally, in our personal quest to see where we end up being exclusive, where I have narrowed my horizons. What kind of people do I rule out? Who don't I listen to? Who do I think immediately is kooky and therefore not worthy of a hearing? No, who is it that I cannot enter into dialogue with? Where does my emotions take me that way? Where am I turned off initially, completely, and so on? Every time I talk about that, I flash on the two young women who came in, two lesbian women, and wanted me to have their marriage. I don't think I handled that real well. Well, this is a number of years ago now. I never saw them again. There may well have been pastoral ministration to be carried on there, that with greater understanding of their situation, that maybe it was possible to do something good for them in helping them and work out their lives or whatever they were about. But I suppose everybody could find their own area where the walls go up, barriers come up, and we turn off. Whoop, you're out, Maybe it's not just always a class or a group. I mean, try this one. I mean, people who come to courses like this are sort of into thinking. And, well, I presume that. I mean, they're into books or reading or like the serious discussion. And, there's a question of maybe people get a certain bias against people who aren't among the book culture people. And we can think of ourselves as part of the book culture. People who read books, like ideas, and so on. Maybe one would have to ask, what do I do with the people who don't partake of the book culture, don't like to read, or aren't into free exchange of ideas like that? Maybe there becomes almost academic kind of snobbery that can easily take over. That's, of course, one of the things that's being said today about exclusivism from the right. That is, that we have produced a new class, as they call it, a new class of intellectuals who have isolated themselves from what the common person is thinking, and are trying to tell the common person what to think and how to act. It's commonly portrayed that way in terms of the people who are in charge of the media. There's all kind of common people who don't like the news. They think that the people who do the news are in charge of it have a sort of snobbish attitude, an elitist approach that looks down on the public as a whole, commonly thought of to be part of that new class. The academics, the intellectuals who make it sort of on their brains or on their degrees or on other kinds of intellectual paraphernalia, and who have lost touch with the rest of the world. They make money out of this whole business. They reach a status that perhaps allows them to look down on other people. Well, I'm just trying to think of where the exclusivism might be. That here these maybe uneducated people have nothing to say to me. Don't listen to them. Only talk to college people or something. That would be an interesting way maybe to approach this. Well, maybe you've got to think of your own. Well, why don't we take a minute or two to see maybe what people, individuals, groups, classes that one might just sort of automatically exclude or turn off. Let's try that for a minute or so. Now, what that's creating in his mind is a whole lot of doubt and confusion. He begins to question his Catholic upbringing, begins to wonder about the Catholic teachings, and how much of this criticism he's hearing is really true, and so on. And he's getting himself into a state where he hardly knows what he thinks, what to believe, and he ends up with a great deal of confusion. He's moving towards what I might call a total relativism. Now this it seems to me what happens to many people when they come out of an original exclusivism or a narrow view, and they somehow become enlightened or see that that was restrictive, or it was just too constraining for themselves, and they don't like it. They feel almost foolish about having been so dogmatic. For example, a Catholic wakes up one day and says, geez, I always thought only Catholics got to heaven. And now at a certain moment of enlightenment, one says, well, that's ridiculous. Then one says, well, how could I have ever thought that? I mean, that's silly. How could I have been so dumb to think that? And then we're in a stage, or at least a temptation, of using the pendulum swing to move to what one might call a total relativism. Now, I'm not sure how many people really get into this in any kind of full swing. I have the feeling that this happens mostly to educated people, to people who have, do a lot of thinking, or who have taken a lot of courses or got degrees or so on, and sort of intellectually figured out that they don't like this exclusivism, and there isn't any monopoly on the truth, and everything's gray, and they've tried various approaches, and none of them feel satisfying or fulfilling, and they sort of drift into this total relativism. Now, I was talking to a man recently who I think partakes of this. In other words, he doesn't like institutions at all. He doesn't like any rules at all. I mean, he's got this theory that institutions are really all bad and they mess up our heads. He doesn't like to he runs his business without contracts. The lawyers just can't stand it the way he goes about this. He just enters into sort of friendly agreements with all kind of people. And this goes with his family as well in raising his children. He doesn't really have any rules for his kids in raising them. Now, recently I was talking to him, and I found this very interesting because his 14-year-old daughter was going out 4 nights in a row someplace. And he said, well, I don't like that you're going out 4 nights in a row. I don't like that. That's not a good thing. No, I don't think he said this. He just said, I don't like that you're going out like that. Well, that caused an interesting dialogue that's going on here. And he attempted to compromise this thing, and tried to figure out maybe she could do that 2 nights in a row, but not 4. But he didn't get that way very far. She was very strong in her own position and said that, well, she already had these plans made, and how could he presume to come in here and at this last minute change these social plans of hers? After all, she goes to school every day. Why can't she go out and socialize every night? Well, he had trouble with that. He eventually invoked what he called the right of parental domain, which I found to be rather interesting. As he says, he didn't know what it meant. I just thought of it. The right of parental domain suggested that she could not go out 4 nights in a row. So they ended up allowing her to go out 3 nights in a row. But I just hung on every word as he was telling me this story. I mean, it was fascinating to me. I mean, you understand the premises are, there aren't any rules. There aren't any institutional frameworks. There aren't any particular right ways of doing anything. So, if he lives his whole life that way, his business life, his family life that way, what do you do in a situation like that? How do you tell a 14-year-old girl she can't go out 4 nights in a row? You understand the kind of bind you might get in? Maybe he doesn't think of that as a bind. Not if you got the right of parental domain to fall back on. I said something like that's eminently more practical than the right of eminent domain. Anyway, total relativism makes it difficult to do most anything in life. It makes it almost impossible to function. What it does, it binds teachers. It puts teachers in a situation of not being able to make judgments about what's right or wrong or good or bad. It doesn't allow for the world of art critics who could say that this is nonsense. So you had a monkey go take this brush and put it on this canvas. Walk around with a situation where no one's got enough guts to say, that's stupid. Or we say, interesting, yes, worthy of consideration. Don't you get to that point where people almost become afraid to take a stand and say, that's not art, what a monkey does with a paintbrush. I think that it becomes hard to raise children. It becomes hard to make institutions work. It becomes difficult to do much of anything. So that one sees these pendulum swings from a total, an absolute kind of exclusivism over to the question of are there any standards or not, and where they simply disappear, where we have no criterion by which to make judgments. where we perhaps are afraid to step in and to say, this is shoddy work. No, I mean, it gets hard as a teacher. I mean, teachers know this. I mean, people take offense at that. If you look at this work and say, well, that's poor work. Yeah, I mean, one teacher told me recently, some student wanted to pass. He answered 2 out of 5 questions. He even answered 3 of them. Couldn't understand why he got a failing grade. I mean, teachers know this. The students take offense at telling them that, you know, your thought here is incorrect. It doesn't match up. We get into a position of being able to, the only real answer is, well, I feel this way. I feel this is right. You feel that is right. So what are we going to do? No one's right. No one knows. And then I think we lose all ability to make progress, to make discerning judgments, to teach people, to improve the human situation, and so on. Well, maybe someone who was terribly nationalistic thought my government right or wrong, American system's the only way. Then they study things about the colonial period. They study about the treatment of the American Indians. They think about some of the treaties we've entered into, some of the ways we've treated other countries, and past invasions of Nicaragua, whatever. They become enlightened. And sometimes you see people move from that to another situation like, well, our government's as bad as the Soviet government. Well, one's as bad as another. Oh, America is spelled with a K. And that, of course, begins to turn people off. You know, I sense in that kind of language a lack of nuanced judgment. That's where people react to that and say, well, go live in Russia then if you think it's, you know, that our government's the same as theirs. So maybe you get some people who are into a religious exclusivism for one reason or another, and then they come out of that and they're over here saying, well, I don't know, one religion's as good as another. You happen to be this, you happen to be that. There's no way of making any judgments about which one might be truer to the human situation, which one might have a fuller understanding of the divine human relationship. Just one's as good as another. So someone, you know, that was into Western civilization and so on begins to study the East. They study Buddhism, for example, and they read these beautiful texts of Buddhist thought. It sounds so pure and neat. And in their mind, they contrast that with the crummy parish they belong to, where the priest is an authoritarian and the nun threw him up against the wall, and where the liturgy is lousy, and they say, aha, Buddhism. You know, that's it. And they're using an ideal. I mean, if they went and lived in a Buddhist monastery someplace, they'd probably find there's backbiting there, and people don't get along, and all the other things come out. But they're comparing this ideal with the reality they know. They end up sort of throwing out this thing that they grew up with. Okay, problem of total relativism. Now, I don't feel that, you know, maybe in our circles here, that's as big a problem. But I'd put it to you this way. Are there ways in times when we're almost afraid to make a judgment about what's true or false, what's beautiful or ugly? There are times when we would have strong feelings about something or intuitions and we just back off. Maybe a parental generation that would say, geez, these kids are so smart, they're so sophisticated, they know so much, I better not say too much to them. Nor are there teachers among us who have let students get by with shoddy work without really challenging them, without calling them to do better kind of work and saying, you just simply didn't write well here. How do you get that? Geez, I know I was thinking of a young lady in my room crying because I gave her a B for her final grade, you know, and right before she get into graduate school and so on, and go over the paper, and it just simply wasn't good work. And she puts all this psychological pressure on me, you know, tears and everything. And won't get into graduate school, you know, my whole life will be ruined. You know, I mean, what do you do then? She got a B. That's exactly what she got. but I mean, you understand the temptation. Understand the temptation to give in a way. Well, I don't know. I'm trying to look for the ways that we might find ourselves backing off the search for truth, being too wishy-washy, not speaking up for what we think is right. Maybe that's where it happens a lot of times. That something just isn't kosher, it's gone not right, and yet we're afraid to step in and challenge that in some way. I'm thinking of an example. I was in a group, one of the mixed group, a lot of people I didn't know. One of them was my student here, and somebody made sort of a slurring remark about Jewish people. I jumped on it just like that. So what did you mean by that? Why did you say that? You know, you really shouldn't. I was marvelous. I was so proud of it. I'm sitting there. I didn't say anything. You know, I wish I had, I suppose. But I was so proud of him. One of my students wouldn't let that anti-Semitic remark go by. Just challenged right in the group. I mean, it took a lot of guts. People looking at him like he's weird. You know, so some guy said something about, used a slur word about Jews. So what? Everyone else is ready to accept it, but not him. No, so maybe that's where it comes in for us, where we would just allow that kind of thing to go on. Well, I'm flashing on this. I use this example so often, but I'll say it again. A priest came to a former parish I was in, gave a sermon, and there was all kind of sexist indicated language in his sermon. And one of our college students came up to him and very calmly and just said, "Father, I want to tell you, you can't come here and talk like that. Simply can't. That's not acceptable language here." Man, I was ready. Gee, I happened to overhear the whole thing. You know, again, it was, I think the priest looked at her like he was an older priest, and I had the impression that maybe no one had ever challenged him like that in his whole life. And I wouldn't doubt it, that that's true. Probably no one ever had the guts to come up to him before and say that kind of thing. He was just totally shocked. Well, my presumption is that he will watch his language a little bit the next time that he preaches in some way. Well, I'm off and running here. Where am I? We're trying to get at total relativism and where it might be at work in our own lives. I guess the last part is, where do I lack courage to speak up about truth, about what's right? Whether we're dealing with teenage kids or adults or whatever. Why don't we take a minute to see what we can uncover that way? Just where we might want to be and try to get a feel for what it would look like. Ask ourselves, what are some of the things we have to do to search this out? And of course, the phrase that I'm using, I use all the time to capture that, is this notion of wanting, desiring, searching for a committed openness. A committed openness. An ability to be rooted in a tradition, to know what we think and believe, to be proud of it, to understand it, strengths and weaknesses, and that therefore, because I'm rooted like that, because I got my head together on that, that therefore I am open to truth and goodness and beauty wherever it is to be found. So that's, in general, where I think we would like to be. To be a committed, open person is the way we're going to avoid this exclusivism on one hand and this relativism on the other hand. Now let's try to see how we're going to get there. Do we have enough feel for what it looks like? Probably not. In other words, if I was to adopt this position in relationship to some of the things I said before, it would mean that I would be proud of being a part of Western civilization. It'd be great to have this understanding of Greek philosophy. We're the heirs of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. Know that there are marvelous things that those people have accomplished. We stand on the shoulders of those giants. We've done good things in the Western world, and we're proud of Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Einstein and all that's produced. But because of that we'd be able to go to India to an ashram and to see very simple living there, people weaving their own cloth and people living out of the Hindu religious tradition and living in a way that's very open and spiritual and so on, and be able to go in there and say, not say, hey, what you need is a refrigerator and an air conditioner here, and we'll straighten this all out, but be able to walk in there or see it on television. I mean, we're not traveling to India, obviously, but to see it on television or whatever, and to say, geez, that's neat. Well, those people got something there. That'd be neat. We could simplify our life a little bit. Look at that, how they enjoy doing things with their hands, or how they seem to have a good brotherly, sisterly spirit here in this ashram, this community. That would be something of what a committed, open person would be able to do. No, let's take example of the young man. I don't want to talk to him in terms of stay away from those people. Don't go to that prayer group anymore. Those people are just nothing but trouble. I don't think that's going to work, and it's not the way I'm really going to try to guide him. Where I want him to get to is where he understands his Catholic faith, knows the answer to the objections that they have raised, understands the strengths and weaknesses, and that therefore he can go to this prayer group, enjoy the fellowship, get out of this scripture reading that they've got going there some good things. When the exclusivist language comes up, he can just say, that's nonsense, I screen that out, I know better. Maybe he can challenge it, maybe he can be quiet, but it doesn't affect him, doesn't blow his mind, doesn't upset him. He's risen above that. He knows that that's a bunch of baloney, that these are the only people being saved. But they got something good there. They read the Bible, they're into Christ, and they love one another and all this, and he draws on that. Try to paint a picture of what a committed, open person would be like. What would be a committed, open parent be like? Well, a committed, open parent would be confident of who they are. They would know that they've had a lot of experience and learned a lot in life. And they would be able to say this to their children. On the other hand, they would be able to listen to their children and not have to give them a sermon all the time. They wouldn't feel defensive when they're interacting with their children. When they're looking at that teenager who's so sullen and giving them such a bad time, they would have a big enough perspective that would not let them take it with total seriousness. No, they would rise above that and say, well, all 16-year-olds are sullen like that, or let her be sullen for a while. I mean, what are you going to do about it? It's not the end of the world. That person would have a bigger vision so they wouldn't get bent out of shape. But they'd be able to listen to the concerns, hear behind the words, drink in whatever good things are going on in this young person's life. But they would be bigger because they're more rooted, because they're confident of themselves. What happens, it seems to me, is the adult generation loses confidence that we know what we're doing, that we've understood some things, that we've learned from our experience. And as soon as we lose that, then we act in a defensive, reactionary way to reactive way, I think is the right word I wanted there, to what is happening with the young people. But I'm trying to paint the positive picture of this committed person, committed open parent. They got their head together. They know who they are. They know they've made their mistakes. Willing to say that. Willing to say to the youngsters, yeah, I was wrong there. I didn't do everything perfectly raising you. Yes, you have your legitimate gripes. We know that. On the other hand, we did these good things and so on. They feel good about that, so that now they're able to deal with this youngster in this open kind of way. Well, again, trying to paint a picture for you of what it would be like to achieve this kind of stance. What would we look like? One said in a high school teachers, I used to go around giving talks to high schools and so on. One of my suggestions was always that they should set aside $15,000 at least or more in their budget to hire a committed open person. And this committed open person would just sort of walk around the school all day, walk the hallways, and so that when the young people came up, they could encounter a committed open person. You put a big CO on it. So that when the young people came up against this person would know the religious tradition. They'd be happy about it. They'd be able to say, hey, this works for me. Yes, I don't just happen to be a Catholic. I am a Catholic, and it works for me. It helps me keep my head straight. It helps me when my father dies. It helps me cope with my family situation. It's good. I like it. Helps me. But the same guy walking around the hallway is able to listen to these young people. He doesn't cram it down their throat. He doesn't make them feel crummy after they talk to him. He is firm, but he has built into him this openness. He listens well. Young people talk and say, that guy really listened to me. That's neat. Yeah, on the other hand, he stands for something. Yeah, I told him, that's what they ought to do, is hire people like this to walk around. And then my other suggestion was always that if they didn't have the 20 grand to spend on this, the only other way around this was to have all the teachers and administrators in the school themselves become COs, committed open adults. COA, I guess they are, committed open adults. And so then everybody could do that. Then we'd create a school, then we'd have a Catholic school, for example, that would really function, that would create an environment where young people would have something to bounce off of and would have the chance to grow and have something to rebel against, but also feel they were getting a hearing and they were getting encouragement to do their own growth and development. Well, maybe that's enough by trying to paint this picture. Why don't we take a little break here, then we'll come back and see if there's any questions about that. Good point, and obviously I think the comment at the break relates to the same thing. As soon as we break down some of the barriers that help produce our own security and at least give the chance for other things to enter in, we're not going to get any place. But as soon as you break those barriers down and begin to open up, it's going to cause certain painful experiences. I mean, just look at marriages today that were created on a traditional basis, and they've gone along on that traditional basis, which fundamentally meant the husband was dominant and the wife had her place, so on. Well, okay, I mean, if you start to rattle that situation, if the husband starts to feel like, geez, this isn't right, I'm in too dominant a position here. I mean, if he begins to try to open the doors to another way of relating, then, I mean, he's going to end up doing more dishes than he did before. Well, he's going to end up doing a lot of things and he's going to have to listen in a new way to his wife, and he's going to hear things that are going to hurt him precisely because they will suggest that his previous behavior was not the best possible way of doing it. In other words, it's very possible for him to end up with a lot of guilt feelings about that. If you take it from the other side, as soon as the woman begins to be more assertive in this situation, then she opens up herself for pain. I mean, I'll tell you, there's a lot of times that I've got women in that situation sitting in my room, and I'm saying to myself, and I say it out loud to them, you start on that path, there's a good chance it's going to end up in divorce. You just better know it. You start on that path, I can see it coming, you get that first sign of assertiveness, you get that first sign of independence, of wanting to be their own person and not relate in the old pattern. It's not clear at that point that the relationship can withstand that. I'll tell you, there are many times when I've been sitting there and I heard the first parts of that story, and the bell was off in my head, says, you better know what you're doing. You take 2 more steps along that path, and you might be on an irreversible path to divorce. That's what's happening. Well, that's where it's at, and I think you have to go into that with your eyes open. So it's not just some minor psychic pain that's involved in opening up to new patterns. We're dealing very often with big things. I mean, suppose you started taking seriously the poverty in the so-called developing nations. I mean, where might that take you if you started to be open to that situation? That path is unknown, isn't it? But one can imagine some of the things it might do. It might result in a very great change of lifestyle, of a giving up of many things. So you can see, as soon as you break out of the familiar, ordinary way of doing things and achieve a certain openness, then there is potential problem. But that's balanced by, it seems to me, is the potential for growth at that point. The potential for development, for seeing the world in a new way. We just had our 20th class high school reunion recently, the other night, and I was the preacher at that mass, and I said to this assembled group there, I was talking about midlife as being a time of opportunity. In other words, many people are feeling just the opposite. Geez, my kids are leaving home. What am I going to do? How am I ever going to talk to my husband without the kids there? What will we say to one another? Or, I feel useless in this situation. Or it's almost a feeling like it's old. I got a letter from a friend, also the same age and lives in another city, saying that, his response, is just described the problem of old age. He feels old. He thinks of himself as old. He can't get excited about anything. He read my Reflections article on the World Series, Muted Reactions, and he says, that's simply a sign of old age. That's all that is. His whole letter, this is a 7-page letter analysis in terms of old age. He's folding up his tent. He really is. He's ready to pack it in. That's it. And I was talking to my classmates here, and trying to focus attention on the fact that midlife is filled with opportunities. It's the springboard to better things. It's a chance. Kids leave the home. That's a chance to do something new and different and exciting. It's painful, yes, but it's got its growth side here. All the way along the line, midlife becomes filled with the chance for religious conversion. This is sometimes it's the first time people have been forced to think seriously since their birth of their first baby about things that are deeply religious. There's a chance for religious conversion, a chance to do new things, to develop. In other words, we now know there's an adult life cycle. And that adult life cycle has rhythms to it and great opportunities built into it. So the counterpoint to the pain is the opportunity for growth that is there. And for a richer life, newer life. Geez, I love it when I see people who go through that period and say, geez, this is neat. I'm learning it. I'm going to take a course or read a book or talk to somebody or take up painting or become a potter or whatever it is. You know, when you see them come alive in a new way and they're interesting and mysterious in a new way, marvelous. But I mean, it's always that ambivalence in life, isn't it? I mean, Jesus talked about that in terms of you have to take up your cross to follow me. Seed has to be put into the ground and die before there's new life. It's what we call the Paschal mystery in everyday life, the death-resurrection theme that seems to be so true with human existence. We don't find the growth without the risk. Take the risk. I mean, how do you know if you'll like the new hairdo unless you try it? Try it. Just find out. Is that an answer to one question? Is that what we were doing? Somebody else want to ask a simple, short question? To which the answer is yes or no. Well, let's see what we can do here about establishing this committed, open situation. Now, what Karl Rahner does for us is show us a theology that buttresses, supports those two things of commitment and openness. Now, I'm going to try to sketch that out for you quickly. And it's important to have the main lines of it, or at least to have a feel for it. And it starts with the open side. It's strangely enough, it starts with the universal openness. And it starts out with the fact that God is inexhaustible, and this great God loves everybody who ever lived, and this great God wants everybody to be saved. And because of that, the great God has given herself to everybody. Self-communication, self-giving, what we call uncreated grace. And because the great God has done all of that, therefore, we are changed. We're modified. We're different. We have a different echo inside of our heart. Our consciousness is changed. Our horizons are expanded because the great God has come and touched us with His love, lavished His care upon us, made us important, uniquely important. So you start out with this broad understanding. You know, God did that to American Indians, and to the little Hindu baby in India, to the children of the members of the Politburo in Russia. Well, God's put His image on everybody like that. And because this great God has touched us, it echoes in our conscience, rolls around in our head, and it creates what we call a universal revelation, a word from God, an inner word. An inner word that resonates in the hearts of everybody who's ever lived. Not just white Anglo-Saxon people, not just Christians, not just 20th century people, but every human being who ever lived has the inner word echoing in their mind and heart. Word that's uttered by the great God. And that word that is heard within the heart when we respond to it, when anybody responds to it, then they are involved in what we call saving faith. That's how they get to heaven. They don't have to have an angel appear to them when they're going to die to be able to get them to heaven. All they got to do is say yes to the inner word, follow their conscience, do what they judge to be correct. That is what establishes openness. That sort of understanding of who God is and how He deals with us. That's what allows us Catholics in the Second Vatican Council to say God does not deny His grace of salvation, even to those who have not yet learned to call Him by name. That's why we can affirm easily today and with conviction that even atheists can be saved, even though people who don't know who God is, even the people who reject God can be saved. They're saved because the inner word echoes in their heart, and without being able to put words on it, when they follow their conscience, they are involved in saving faith. That's why, you understand, it's simple enough, isn't it? That's why theologians today think that the Second Vatican Council said that even atheists can be saved. Not because an angel appears to them when they're going to die, but because they have followed their conscience in various ways as they walk the path of life. And because that is God's inner word echoing there. That's the basis for Christian openness. That's why we say that Christians can enter into dialogue with Jews, because the inner word is echoed in the heart of Jewish people and been formulated in the Jewish tradition. And it's God's word, God speaking. That's why we say we can learn from Easterners, from Hindus or Buddhists, because that word is echoed in their heart and they have found a way of grabbing hold of it and of verbalizing that inner word, making it into an outer word, and that we can learn from what they have come to say. That's why males can learn from speaking to females and vice versa, because we think that each other are made in the image of God. There's the divinity stamped in us, because God loves each one of us. If you go right down the line, it breaks down finally all the barriers. Understand, that's what Rahner has done. That's one of the great contributions of Karl Rahner to the 20th century thought. He's given, the bishops arrived at this in an untheological way. The bishops just said that in the Second Vatican Council. It's like a bolt out of the blue. It runs in the face of, we used to have all these sayings, there's no salvation outside the church. Boniface VIII in the 13th century said there's no salvation unless you accept the Pope. That's why Dante put him down in the lower regions of hell. That's not the only reason he did it. Maybe that's not even the reason, but that's where he is in the Divine Comedy. And that's because, he was so exclusive. But that saying was said all throughout history, no salvation outside the church. And then the Second Vatican Council comes along and says atheists can be saved. Just like that, without any much rationale, without much argument. And Rahner's great contribution has been to figure out how they could have said that, to give us an explanation of how the bishops arrived at that position sort of unknowingly. Rahner said that's the way, that's the reason. It's because of this inner word that God has spoken to everybody. And that faith can be implicit. You can be saved without ever hearing of Jesus, without ever saying the name of Christ, even while walking around saying one is an atheist. Provided one follows one's conscience. That's the key. Okay, so one thing I got to do with this young man is he needs a solid theological grounding like that. But he needs the other side of it as well. He's got to know, that gives him some openness now. That's the reason I don't want him to stop going to prayer group necessarily. That's why he can go there and learn something. But now he's got to figure out where he stands with this Catholic tradition that he grew up with and all that education he had. Now he has to get the commitment side of it, the particular side of it. And the theology that stands behind that is that the Word of God doesn't just sort of echo around up there in the skies. It's not an amorphous, vague, cloudy kind of Word at all, but that the Word is always made flesh. The Word is incarnated. God's inner Word comes to real, live people. And it comes to people according to their openness and their capacity to receive it. So that the more receptivity, the more openness, the more that people are able to respond to that Word of God, the call of God, the self-giving of God, then the greater ability they're going to have eventually to be able to say it, to verbalize it, to make it explicit, to talk about it. The Word of God is very concrete. It comes to people. That's Chesterton's line. How odd of God to choose the Jews. How odd of God to choose the Jews. I mean, what is this? The great God, big God, speaks to everybody, but he seemed to do something special with a tiny, insignificant group of crummy slaves in Egypt in the 13th century. That's weird. They were nothing. The Roman Empire was great and powerful. The Egyptians were strong and powerful. This is a crummy, lousy little group of slaves in the mind of the Egyptians. How odd of God to choose the Jews, to speak somehow a particular word to these people. What we say in our theology, therefore, is that God's Word is always taking flesh, and it takes flesh according to the receptivity, the capacity of the people who have received it. And therefore we say that some people in history have been more open, more receptive, more responsive to God's words. Those are what we call the religious geniuses, the great people like Lao Tzu and Confucius in the Chinese world, like Siddhartha Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, or like Muhammad, the founder of Islam, like Abraham and Moses and Isaiah, the principal figures in the Hebraic tradition. And what we say as Christians, and this is crucial, is that the fullest response to the inner Word, the clearest, most decisive, is found in Jesus of Nazareth. So it's easy for us. Lao Tzu is a prophet, or we can find wisdom in Siddhartha Gautama. And we even can find wisdom in Muhammad. But what we say as Christians, and what our conviction is that the full expression of this is found in Jesus of Nazareth. He is the final complete Word, the final prophet, the absolute Savior. Not that others don't have the truth, but that we find it most completely expressed in Jesus Christ. That becomes the basis for particularity, for commitment, for standing someplace, for having standards. Well, why is it that someone would ultimately say, well, Hitler killed Jews and Mother Teresa saves dying people in Calcutta. Each is sort of doing their own thing. Well, we are revolted by that thought. It's a revulsion that comes inside of us to even think like that or to say that out loud. But ultimately, how do we make that decision? I mean, what basis do we say? Well, as a Christian, we say we're supposed to love and care for people, and that's what Mother Teresa does. Hitler killed people, responsible for such enormous cruelty the mind can't even comprehend it. And that's opposed to what Jesus taught, the final prophet. So there are criterion in this viewpoint. You can't just say, do your own thing, or one thing's as good as another. There are ways of making judgments. The cross is the judgment upon all of the other expressions or claims to goodness and truth and beauty throughout the world. The gospel is our way of having some place to stand. So that, I would say, becomes the basis of commitment, of how one avoids a total relativism. Now that's maybe heavy. The inner Word seeks objectification. The inner word seeks an outer word. God's word echoes in the heart of every person, but then it is concretized. Then it is objectified. Then it becomes out here. So Jesus teaches this, tells us about Abba, Father. He gets a community of followers. They remember this. The man Jesus, the historical Jesus. They tell others about him. They use what Jesus said to solve problems. They gather for the liturgy to remember who Jesus was, and they go out and try to be charitable like he told them to do. And you get a religion. You get an institutionalized religion that's trying to embody the inner word that Jesus heard and began to make external. In this situation, churches, institutions, and so on are not bad things entirely, but they have a good side to them, the side that preserves the inner word, this fundamental truth of what Christ was all about. Well, let's take a couple minutes here. What I invite you to do is to try to turn the person next to you and see if you could say in your own words what that theology is. That'd be sort of hard, but why don't you try to see what you could get out of what I just said, what you understood. Why don't you try to tell the person next to you what you understood of all of that. Let's do it a couple minutes. Of commitment. Now, one of the things the young man in my example is having trouble with now is committing himself to his Catholic heritage. He's now in doubt about it. Now, how am I going to help him to get himself rooted there? One of the things is he has to know more about his tradition. It's interesting, a lot of the things he knows already, but he just can't pull together. And I must admit that I have gotten frustrated with him. In other words, he has to be able to answer those objections to the religion that I brought up before. I'm not going to go through them all, but take one. The fact that they claim in this comic book, that Catholics have no concern for the Bible at all, and reject all of that. I say to the lad, for years you went to church every week, at least for a 3-year period, you went to Mass every Sunday. 3 sections of the Scripture are read to you every time like that. What is this of saying the Catholic Church has no regard for that? 3 passages from the Bible read every Sunday. You went every Sunday for 3 years. You heard of large portions of the Bible read. Not only that, but we have all the encyclicals of the 20th century encouraging us to read the Scriptures. We've got Bible classes all over the place at parishes and so on. We've got people reading the Scriptures on their own. It's just patently false. And it's with a little bit of thought, he should know that. See what I mean? I mean, there's a clear answer to that. This simply is ridiculous to hold that. You can pull a quote out of a pope in the 19th century who was worried about private interpretation and warned people about that. But we've got a whole dominant tradition that the lad lives in. He has to know that. And I'm not talking about obscure knowledge. I'm talking about something he could have figured out just by reflecting on what he's been doing each Sunday for 21 years. See what I mean? In other words, if he's going to get committed to this tradition, he's got to be able to answer that. I mean, he should know, or I should be able to help him to figure out that we don't think of ourselves as cannibals. I mean, that's the charge, and you've probably seen this literature yourself. That's why the charge is that we're cannibals. Well, a simple understanding of the sacraments would help him to understand that the sacraments are symbols or signs, that Jesus comes to us under the appearances of bread and wine, under the symbol of bread and wine. It's the symbol that conveys the meaning. We're eating the bread. Oh, that's what conveys to us Jesus' life-giving presence. I mean, it's a little bit of subtle, not even all that subtle thinking could help him to answer this charge that we are cannibals as Catholics. Same thing could be done with reading the first chapters of Luke and Matthew in relationship to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Simple distinctions about honoring Mary and not worshiping her, of seeing that she's an important person, of understanding the great importance of the symbol of Mary in today's world. He should have some counter questions to that group he goes to. He ought to be ready to ask them, how does your group treat women? What do you do in here? Literal reading of Ephesians 5, women be subject to their husbands. That's a really good question to him to have to ask in that grouping. In other words, what I'm trying to show you is that we're not in a corner on this thing. These people who the new exclusivists are on shaky intellectual grounds. There are no big, powerful intellects behind that movement. Their theology is shallow and superficial. I had two guys in my room sitting there with their Bibles in hand and this crummy literature, and they're reading this stuff to me. It says, Catholics say this. There was a quote out of the Second Vatican Council, and I recognized it. That's interesting. Read me that. And it stopped at one place, and I said, let me show you that quote. And I took out the book, and I showed them the quote, the rest of the quote, and the rest of the quote was exactly opposite of the position they were trying to tag us Catholics with. And one of the kids sat there and says, geez, I mean, he was just shocked that this literature was so shoddy in what they were saying. Well, everybody's ready with a quote like that, but there are certain things that we can know that help us to undercut this new exclusivism that is around. It's shoddy intellectually. It doesn't hold water. We've got to have confidence in relationship to that. Well, we're not back in some corner, meek, no theology, no way to answer these tough questions about cannibalism. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. A little bit of knowledge, the Second Vatican Council. Doesn't even take a lot. A little religious literacy. Read a book sometime. You can, it's not all that hard to answer these things. So the young man has to know this. He always had to tell him, we read the Bible 3 passages every Sunday. What are you talking about? Okay. Now, the other thing that to get at this commitment question here is we have to see the real value in life of being able to commit ourselves. We have to see that committing ourselves is what frees us to do creative things. That it's more human to live with commitment and standards and norms and principles than it is to just walk around and waffle on everything or be wishy-washy. It's more human. It's what reveals the goodness of life. Remember Flannery O'Connor, the great Catholic short story writer? That she said, well, doesn't your Catholic faith restrict your creativity? Flannery O'Connor said, you got to be kidding me. What do you mean restrict my creativity? The Catholic faith, that religion, the whole institutional thing there is precisely what frees me to be creative. That's why I can write my fiction, write my short stories. It's precisely because I've got a framework. It's interesting that so many Southerners are great novelists, great writers. Commonly thought is it's because they got a worldview. I thought that in Jesse Jackson's speech at the convention. I mean, where was the power of Jackson's speech at the Democratic Convention? My sense was that he spoke out of a worldview, out of a conviction, out of a world that some people know. It was a biblical world, wasn't it? It was filled with biblical imagery. It wasn't flighty. It wasn't up in the sky. It was earthy. It was real. It was, it might not be the world we know exactly, but you knew it was a world. You know what I mean? A set way of thinking that had parameters and limits and categories and words that everyone understood. What I'm saying is that to be someplace is what frees us. That's so important. How could I say it? I was talking to a woman the other day who, marriage is in trouble and so on, and she's feeling so bummed out. She's on a yo-yo and everything, and she told me she's doing 110% better. She said, well, what happened? She said, I just decided that a divorce was not a viable option. Boom. And she said, once I said that to myself, everything changed. Everything changed. The whole world looked different to me now. It was freeing her up to make the most out of whatever she had. I talk to young people about, can't make a decision about marriage again. Can't, decide to get into it or not. And I'm talking about situations that look good and people seem to be compatible and no obvious reason why they shouldn't be. They've been going together a long time, all of those things. And it's almost like you have to, it's a little more, a little bit, and then the decision is made. The person says to me, it's all so easy. It made all the difference. It was the commitment that opened my eyes to the potential of what's going on here. I so often use that phrase from Marcel that a trial marriage proves only one thing, that is whether a trial marriage works or not. It's got nothing to do with marriage. I think there's a truth in that. I mean, I don't want to, sound glib about that because I think it's a difficult question, but there's something true about that. It doesn't prove only thing that proves anything about marriage, that marriage is different because it is a commitment. And that's what changes everything about it. Well, that is one of our major problems today, isn't it? It is seeing this, that we're in a period where commitment is not in anything. We want to hang loose. We want to keep our options open. We got to keep doors open here. We don't want to get hemmed in too quickly. Don't push me, Let's, and it's in the air. I can't get away from it. I think it'd be silly to think we get away from it. It's so much in the air we breathe that we probably infects us whether we know it or not. Hard to get down to that business of just saying do it no matter what. I often talk about that in terms of loophole decisions. You ever decide you're not going to eat dessert or something, or you're not going to do something? In the back of your mind, you know that for almost any reason you're going to do it. You're sitting there and say, I am not eating dessert today. Of course, if I have a tickle in my throat, it might mean I'm getting a cold, and you should feed a cold. You sort of know that. But there's another kind of decision, I call it a non-loophole decision. It has a different feel to it, a different quality to it. And it's got the sense of, I don't care if my throat is bothering me. Those things are not going to make any difference. I'm not eating dessert today. It has a different feel about it, a different quality. And you sort of know it in the moments of honesty, the difference. Well, it seems like we got to, in many things, to go away the culture's going, we got to get more of those non-loophole decisions about life. Then we're going to probably function better, do better. And my great claim is that will free us up in some way. Make us, as Flannery O'Connor says, more creative, not less. We can see that. The woman who decided she wasn't going to get a divorce, I can see why it's going better. Is because once she decided that, now her behavior and attitude is different. No wonder her husband's happier these days. It was obvious. She just behaves differently towards him than she did before. Well, that was an option. Let me take up a final problem. And that is what I will call the problem of embarrassment. And that is, part of this lad's problem is that these people have uncovered to him real problems with the Catholic heritage. I mean, we're not a perfect community. We've got a crummy, checkered history in many ways. They got all this information about popes with illegitimate children. They got stuff in there about the Crusades, going out killing infidels, about burning heretics at the stake, about the Inquisition. They got all kind of stories about authoritarian bishops and priests and so on. That's all in there. I mean, and there is a whole lot of truth in it. One can't get away from it. Any honest, critical reading of the history of Christianity uncovers those kinds of things. And we need to know what to do about that. Our church is not perfect. Even in our own century, we see things that don't seem to make sense to people. Many people feel that about the birth control question. I mean, just how is it possible for, the Pope to take a rigid position on this with the great population problems, with all the advances in theological biblical understanding? I mean, there are some Catholics who find that to be an embarrassment. And you have to figure out what to do about that. Now, I believe that the starting point in this is to realize that any institution, any community is going to have an ambivalent history. It's going to be a mixture of good and evil. So if you want to point out impositions to me, I have to say, yes, bad part of our history. I don't want to defend it. But let's not forget that that same community built hospitals during that period. Same community has taken care of widows and orphans. That same community has a campaign for human development to help the poor people in the United States. In other words, we have to be ready to say the good things about what the community has done as well. Have to be able to get a balanced picture of that. You have to start out with the premise that any institution, any community is going to have a mixed history. That goes for Marxism or for the country of France or anything you want to end up talking about. I think that would be a help. I think as well, what we have to do is to be able to sort of assimilate that history into it. I don't think we can just hate it and try to disassociate ourselves from it. That, of course, is largely what the Protestant response was in the 16th century, to disassociate itself from that heritage from the previous centuries. And it seems to me that whatever the checkered past is, that somehow I have to bring it into myself, into the light of consciousness, and to eventually get at ease with it. Got to do that with my own past, with the mistakes, with the sins, with the insensitivities, with the opportunities lost. I have to be able to bring that, not just be embarrassed about it. Yeah, I might be embarrassed about it. That's brought up, talked about, someone raises it or whatever. It's sort of embarrassing, but I have to be able to rise above that and say, yeah, that was me, and now I don't want to do that anymore. Now I want to get beyond it. I want to do better. In other words, to use the embarrassment as a positive catalyst for making progress in my personal life. I think eventually we have to do that in the Catholic community. Ronner says it's going to be so important for us to develop what he calls a theology of error, so that when the church changes its mind on birth control, its official leadership, that instead of saying, beginning the first paragraph, as the church has always taught, that there would be, as the church has always taught, contraception is okay in some cases. Instead, when it changes its mind on a question, instead of saying it that way, to come up with a way of honestly admitting the limitations of our understanding on that question for many centuries and our deeper understanding of what the Scriptures mean now. In other words, we're honest that we need a theology of error, being able to understand how error is part of the growth of the community. Instead of thinking that we have to think we were always right on every question, which would be just a little hard to do when you think of the fact that we condemned usury and condemned the notion of religious freedom at one time and said that outside the church there is no salvation. It's a little hard to say that we were always right on every question, since we've already changed our mind on very important questions. So we need a way of understanding that, which means that the community gradually grows in its perception of the faith, that that's normal and human and part of life. So we're going to have to deal with embarrassments if we're going to be this committed, open person. I got to help this young man to understand his heritage, to be able to answer the objections, to prime him for those bad things about the church. Better if he hears it from me than in reading it in this silly comic book, because I can put it in perspective for him. He's got to know the strengths of the community at the same time. Also, he can root himself, feel proud of his heritage, stand someplace, be committed, and because he's like that, because he gradually gets his head together, now he's no longer prey to this new exclusivism. Now he's sorted out. Now he can see through it. Now I don't have to worry about him anymore, that some new group's going to come and love bomb him and he's gone again. But that he has learned how to deal with that, to be open to the goodness, the warmth, Christocentric approach, Bible reading, anything good that's there, he can drink it in, but he can cut through the exclusivism and maintain his own integrity and his own position. That's how I want him to be able to function here. Well, let's see if we have comment, question, fill-ins, rebuttals, statements. Yes. Let me comment on your first comment and then try to respond to the question. I think that's the point. Right? It was all very clear. Don't get you confused with the facts. It was all very clear to me at one point. The problem with any exclusivist position is precisely that you can't allow for dialogue. You can't admit that the other person has a point because your system might collapse. That's what's happening with the new exclusivists. That's why you can't dialogue. It's a total system built on the inerrancy of the Scriptures. And they can't let in one little crack. Because if they do, the whole system will fall down. The system functions as a security for them. And therefore, there's no dialogue. I often tell a story about the master's student in geology who, challenged me, and I said, well, I can go along. I believe you're a Christian, striving to someone. Can you admit the same thing for me? And the kid, very sad, good, nice young lad, said no. He could not make the affirmation that he thought of me as a Christian. He could not do that because he said it clearly, as soon as I would do that, then I got to admit that some of parts of what you say might be right, and as soon as I do that, my system falls. So it's not just the psychological or pride thing that don't confuse me with the fact.